Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is David Kramer. I am director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it is our pleasure to sponsor this evening a book talk by Howard Langer for his novel, The Last Dekrepitzer. Howard, I have to tell you, I was on the subway the other day riding, between stations, and whenever I would come in and see the way the signs are, the subway tile on the wall, I thought of the cover of your book, which is just marvelous. We at the Library of JTS, of course, have sponsored book talks throughout the years, and it's really a joy for us to bring your collective attention to books that are important in one way or the other to a Jewish readership. This is a very wonderful, engaging, and unexpected book. As I was going through and asking myself how I would describe it, what I wound up doing is actually writing down individual adjectives, and the adjectives went something like this: clever, engaging, unexpected, serious and playful, erudite. It's got everything. I read it months and months ago. We had some difficulty getting the right scheduling for this talk, but I will not forget it. And I hope that those of you who have not yet had a chance to read it, and it is a National Jewish Book Award winner, if you haven't had a chance, then I hope that the presentation, the author's discussion tonight, will encourage you, will inspire you to get a copy and to read it because it really is a delight. And so before we go on, before I pass the screen over to Howard, whom I will highlight, I just want to remind you, please, to stay on mute during the presentation. If you stray off of mute, I will find you and remute you in any case. But after the author's presentation, there will be some time for questions and discussion. Please be aware that this is being recorded so that those who weren't able to make it synchronically with the presentation will be able to watch it after the fact. But I'm sure that both they and we collectively will learn a lot about the art of creating a world, because that's really what it feels like here, Howard. Please go right ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, I have to say it's really quite an honor for me to talk to this group. I was only once to the library at the seminary, and that was when I was in high school after the fire. And I was part of the people volunteering to dry books. And I spent all my time putting paper towels between pages of very fine
So
books.
you were part of that group, huh?
I was part of that
Yeah,
group, yes.
that's a legendary group. It's sort of like the people, who were at Woodstock say, I was there. So the people who were doing the paper towels, the library fire, all report I was there.
Yeah, I was there. It was tedious, but it was interesting.
Uh-huh.
Well, I don't know how many people have actually read the book, so I guess I'll begin by telling you a little bit about what the book is about. Imagine that a Holocaust survivor ends up in the rural South among rural Blacks rather than in a major American city among the Jews where most ended up. And imagine that this survivor is the scion of a line of Hasidic rabbis and is himself now the Rebbe of his sect because everyone in his sect, including his father and grandfather, were murdered during the war. And finally, imagine that he, as a result of his experience in the Russian army going through the Ukraine, believes that all the Jews have been killed, at least all of the Jews in Europe have been killed. And that was the beginning of my thinking when I began this story, those three items. And one other item which was very important was that in this sect, the Rebbe always led his Hasidim by fiddling. And I got this idea because the Rebbe in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Pizechner, before the war, led his Hasidim in fiddling. And I kind of read that many years ago and filed it away and said, someday I have to do something with that idea. So we discovered the Rebbe fiddling in the 59th Street IRT station in the early 1960s. And the book opens with that, and we discover that he speaks Black English. And the question is, how did he end up in the subway station? And the book describes his odyssey from being an Eloy, a extraordinary student pre-war, being prepared to be the next Rebbe of the sect being the Dekrepitzers. And we follow him through yeshiva, through his pre-war experience and his abduction from Dekrepitz by the Russians during the period that Dekrepitz was occupied by the Russians at the beginning of the war. He ends up being saved by a group of American soldiers, a group of Black soldiers who are playing music, waiting to go home, jamming on the docks in Naples. And he sees them and takes out his fiddle, the ancestral fiddle, and begins playing. And they join in with his playing. They eventually play together every day and eventually smuggle him to rural Mississippi, where he spends the first years of his life. And his whole introduction to America is to this Black culture. A very, very different introduction to America than most survivors had. Now, last night, PBS began a series, Black and Jews in America. I don't know whether any of you saw it, but the book kind of dovetails with that series, which it's a 4-part series. So if you missed it, you can catch parts of it. So far, it was really quite fascinating last night. And it dovetails in that the Rebbe ends up in rural, just give you one example, he ends up in this rural Mississippi. But this rural Mississippi is comfortable for him because it reminds him of the shtetl that he came from. It's poor, it's got nothing. And there are all these points of contact for him. He just feels comfortable left alone. He raised chickens when he was in the shtetl in Dekrepitz, and he's raising chickens when he's in rural Mississippi. I won't give you the rest of the book, but the book follows him through Mississippi to New York, ultimately to a chicken farm in New Jersey, where the book ends. So how did I come to write the book? I actually saw a presentation on Zoom during COVID by the great writer George Saunders. And it was a workshop. And during the workshop, he said, if you want to write, you have to sit down and do it. You can't think about it. You can't talk about it. You just have to pick up the pencil and sit down and write. And it made a strong impression on me. I was 70 years old. I said, if I'm going to write, I better start. And I started writing the next morning. I had an idea about what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write something that would explain Jews to Blacks and Blacks to Jews, because I was quite upset with the tension between the two communities. But the book I wrote really was something very different than that, though I think it does accomplish that goal. The characters really ran away with it. I wrote a short story at first, which was the story about the Rebbe being discovered in the Columbus Circle subway station fiddling. And someone said to me, that story is not a story, it's a novel, Howie. And I was dubious, but that person happened to know me much better than I knew myself. And I knew that she knew me better than I knew myself. So I went home, and the first question was, how did the Rebbe end up in that subway station? And there were many false starts. I thought that the Rebbe was going to be totally alone, was going to be living in a walk-up in Hell's Kitchen. And it turned out not to be that case at all. Basically, the Rebbe and the other characters in the book wrote themselves, is the only way I can describe it. Each chapter came to me at a different point in time. I didn't write them chronologically. I would come down to dinner and say to my wife, "You won't believe what the Rebbe did today. You won't believe what happened to the Rebbe today." And this went on for about a year. And there were changes. I thought that the Rebbe was going to marry a black woman when he was in Mississippi. And I thought that their marriage was going to fall apart when they got to New York because of all of the strains and stresses that would be on an interracial marriage in the early 1950s, let alone one between a Rebbe and a woman who grew up in Mississippi. And I got stuck. Let me shut off my, bear with me 1 second so we won't get these interruptions. I was stuck. I could not, in writing, I couldn't think of what kinds of humiliations they would suffer that would lead to the breakup of the marriage. So I'm a lawyer, and I took a woman I was representing pro bono, an African-American woman who worked as a docent at one of the stops on the Underground Railroad that's near my house. I live in Philadelphia. And I took her to lunch, and she said she'd help me. And she said, "Tell me what the book's about." And I described the marriage to her, and she said to me, "Oh, Mr. Langer, I can't help you." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? Why not?" She said, "Because nothing, no humiliations could break the love between those people." To which I said, "Well, you know what that means, Mrs. So-and-so." And she said, "What?" I said, "Well, the wife's going to have to get cancer." And she said to me, "Oh, no, Mr. Langer, you'd ruin your book if you took that woman out of the book. You'd ruin your book." And those who've read the book have said to me that, in fact, at the midpoint, that is, at the point at which the action shifts to New York City from the South, the wife really takes over the book in a very big way. And when I've spoken, I haven't spoken to many Black groups, but when I've spoken to Black groups about the book, they're very taken by the wife and her agency and her emunah, her faith as well. She converts and has a certain faith that her husband, I won't say he lacks, but differs. So that's how the book came to be written. I guess it's traditional in these talks to do a reading of some parts of it. So I was debating because the protagonist does have discussions about why he won't go to the Jewish Theological Seminary, but I actually don't think they're the best parts of the book, so I'm not going to read them to you. So I'm going to read a section that involves Shmuel Meir, that's the Dekrepitzer, the Rebbe, at the deathbed of Harold Carr, who's the father of the soldier who he meets in Naples, who leads to his being saved and brought to Mississippi. Harold Carr had begun hemorrhaging and coughing up blood. Willie had driven him to the new Negro hospital in Mound Bayou, but they could do nothing for him. He'd been bedridden since they'd returned. Harold sent Willie to fetch Shmuel Meir. Harold looked small, buried in the sheets. Shmuel Meir sat down by his bedside and took his hand. Harold stared at him and moved his lips before the words came. "Young man, I asked you when you first came here if you were a rabbi. You remember that?" "I remember." "You ain't answer me straight." "No, I didn't." "You a rabbi, ain't you?" "Yes, I'm a rabbi." "You pray for me, Rabbi." "I've been praying for you, Mr. Carr. I pray for you all the time." "What's your prayer?" "I pray for the healing of your body." "My body's finished, Rabbi. Best pray for my soul." "Mr. Carr, your soul pure. You raised your boy and he volunteered and went and fought against the great evil overseas, taught him goodness so that in the end he saved me. You took me in when I ain't had nothing and treated me like your own. Your soul pure. Your life been good and filled with kindness." "No, Rabbi, my soul's all soiled with sin. I need your prayers." Birch would say, "He pray for me," but you, Rabbi, I need your prayer. You dead wrong, Mr. Carr. Your soul pure, if any soul pure. But you can have my prayer from, excuse me, but you can have any prayer from me you ask. But why my prayer so important? Because you seen him like nobody else here seen him. The Bible don't got nothing that match what you done seen. Your prayer will be a special prayer. When the time comes, I'll pray for your soul. I brought my fiddle to bring you some music. My music a prayer too. A prayer needs to be with words. That's how we learned. I'll pray for you. I'll pray for your body so long as you have a breath of life. And I'll pray for your soul when your soul is released. It ain't the custom for my people to pray for the soul when there's still life in the body. With words and with music. In the Hebrew language that Birch would say is his language. In the Hebrew language. It's the only language I can pray in. But here, I'll play you a nigun like I played you back when we first met. He started a nigun that was part of his grandfather's morning prayers, but then stopped. Harold turned his head and said, "Fix me, Jesus." Shmuel Meir played and the sick man rasped, "Fix me, Jesus, fix me. Oh, fix me, oh, fix me, oh, fix me. Fix me, Jesus, fix me. Fix me for my long white robe. Fix me, Jesus, fix me. Fix me for my starry crown. Fix me, Jesus, fix me." Days later, when Harold died, Shmuel Meir stood outside the shack looking out at the coops they'd built together and recited the traditional prayer for his soul, El Mole Rachamim, in the language that was his language. The opening words, God filled with mercy, stuck in his throat, and he forced his way through to the words praying that Harold's soul would rest eternally in Eden among the holy ones. Then he took up his fiddle and prayed until his arm gave out. So I think that that section actually brings together much of what the book is about because it brings together the Black English of Shmuel Meir and his Black background and the melding of the two cultures in one scene. So it's, I think, one of the better parts of the book from my perspective. So what is the book all about? For me, the book was about, to a very great degree, man's communication with God, the role of music, and the role of tefillah, of prayer. And as a backdrop to all of this is this whole Black Jewish thing going on in the book. But for me, it really was Shmuel Meir's confrontation with God throughout the book that drove me, so to speak. In the early part of the book, before the war, when he's in yeshiva, he goes out and plays every every Saturday night at the Hasidic yeshiva, and they, go into ecstatic dancing and singing and so on. And his Rosh Yeshiva at the yeshiva that he actually goes to, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who is a real person, in real life, disapproves of this and reprimands him. He says to him, "It's avodah zarah what you're doing. It's idolatry. It's what the Greeks would have done." But he realizes that Shmuel Meir is a very special person, that he's first a tremendous Eloi, and second, that he has this extraordinary love of God, and that his fiddling is an expression of his love of God. And I should say that the young Shmuel Meir is very much modeled on Rabbi David Weiss Halivni's description of his childhood before the war and what it was like to be an Eloi in a small town, to be, such a prodigy. And I had read his autobiography many years ago, and I didn't realize when I was writing how much it influenced my writing about the protagonist in my book. But then I recently reread his autobiography and just shook my head at how much of him is in the book. Because there is a character in the book later, Hirsch, who becomes the Dekrepitzer's best friend, who is really character based entirely on Rabbi Weiss Halivni. And the two of them get into arguments because the Dekrepitzer never ever doubts that there's God. The Dekrepitzer's problem is that he holds the entire Masorah in his head. He can do the pin trick where you could put a pin into the Talmud and he could tell you what word it would pass through on each page. And he does that in the book. And I read in Rabbi Weiss Halivni's autobiography that he could do that just as well. But Rabbi Weiss Halivni's view of the Holocaust was that God had withdrawn himself. He uses the Kabbalistic term tzimtzum. And he'd withdrawn himself so that man would have free will. And man exercised that free will in the most awful way. So in the book, he twice in conversations with the Dekrepitzer says he doesn't intervene. And each time he does this, the Dekrepitzer blows up and says, doesn't intervene? No, you just argue that way because you don't want to accept what God has done. God is, just because God doesn't fit your image doesn't mean he didn't do these things. And the argument is between he who holds he really does hold the whole Masorah in his head, but he believes that it's fake. It's not true. God has violated the basic fundamental principles. And any of you who have any experience with Rabbi Weiss Halivni know that his approach to text was so extreme that when he describes in his autobiography that he found a page of a Shulchan Aruch that a Nazi guard was using as a wrapper for his lunch, when Rabbi Weiss Halivni gets the page and retrieves it in the concentration camp, he then describes not just the page, but what edition of the Shulchan Aruch it came from and when it was printed, all of which he knew from just getting this one page, which is very typical of his writing and so on, of his erudition. So you have this clash between these two friends, one of whom believes that in the Masorah in a very real way, and the other one who believes that he's been totally betrayed and that everything that he's been taught is no longer true, but he believes in God. And so he fiddles. He fiddles 3 times a day. He fiddles his prayers. But he fiddles, at least from his point of view, to remind God constantly of what he did. And his tefillah is beyond words. There are no words for his tefillah. And it's interesting because I spoke recently to a group at my local shul, and there was a woman there who was a cellist, and she said to me, why can't tefillah just be the music? And here it was, I'd written this book in which the protagonist basically has his tefillah just as the music, but it didn't really strike me in the way in which this woman put it, that music alone could be the total expression that was necessary for tefillah. So that is a very big motif in the book, this effort to find some way to communicate. And it's underscored because Shmuel Meir, the Dekrepitzer, is a Rebbe. And the Rebbe's role was to be something of an intermediary between his Hasidim and the Almighty. And here, the Dekrepitzer has no Hasidim. And one of the big issues in the book is that he no longer has the mission that he was put on earth to perform because he has no Hasidim, which is a second motif that the book has in it, which is he also becomes very close friends with the Bavavar Rebbe, who is a real person in the book and who I apparently met as a very little child. I remember when I was 4, I grew up on the West Side, and the Bavavar had his shtibel on the West Side at the time. And I just remember that my father, who generally did not go to the shtibel, but every so often would, to entice me to go to shul, would go there because they had the most delicious kugel. So I remember the kugel, but I don't remember the Rebbe. But the other thing that I know my father told me years later that the Boviver showed him a picture of himself during the war, because the Boviver survived the war by shaving his beard and shaving his payas and getting false papers as a Hungarian Catholic. And for those of you who speak Yiddish, I urge you, there is a wonderful, wonderful YouTube video of the old Boviver Rebbe describing his experiences during the Holocaust to his Hasidim, but it is in Yiddish, and there's no translation that goes with it, but it's an extraordinary video. So um, the Boviver and the Dekrepitzer are a contrast with each other because the Boviver did have Hasidim at the end of the war, only a small number, but he had Hasidim. And while I've read in a number of places that he too suffered a tremendous period of, we'll call it religious angst after the war. He'd lost his wife and most of his family during the war. When he came to America, he was persuaded by the other rebbes, by the then Lubavitcher Rebbe, known as the Friedeke, and the Satmar, to rebuild. And so he had a mission. And there's this series of discussions between the Boviver and the Dekrepitzer, which helps define the role of the Rebbe and why the Dekrepitzer is so alone and why the Boviver is not preoccupied with the questions that the Dekrepitzer has. I should say, I gave a talk last week on Holocaust Memorial Day at the, it was online because of the weather, but it was at the Bayit in Riverdale. And I talked about the real lives of these different people that I've been talking about, the Boviver and Rabbi Weiss Halivni and Rabbi Wasserman and so on. And I do have that. If anybody wants it at the end, you can send me an email and I'll be happy to send you. I finally wrote it up after I gave it. So there's one other character who's in the book that people who read it don't quite catch. So maybe we'll see if any of you catch it. But there's a character in there who's a kind of Shlomo Carlebach character named Sanoblik, who's much younger than the Dekrepitzer, and he actually meets him in Washington Square in the 1950s, where there would be all the folkies in the square. And I guess it's the 60s, not like the 50s, 60s, whatever. And the this character Sanoblik is very taken by the Rebbe's nigunim and insists that he teach him some of his nigunim. And they later get together and in a shtibel somewhere on the west side, and the Rebbe plays with this guy Sanoblik. And at the end, Sanoblik says, "Listen, I want to show you what I've done." And he starts playing one of the Rebbe's nigunim, but he has put words to it. He's put words that particularly pain the Rebbe. Tehilat Hashem Yidaber Pi, praising God. And the Rebbe blows up and he tells him never to play his music again and stalks out. And I actually thought for myself that Sanoblik was a character providing some hope for the future, who could bring the words and the music back together again in some way. But the Rebbe, of course, rejects that completely. Why is he in the Black community? Well, he's in the Black community at first because I wanted him to be totally alone. And I thought being a white Rebbe in the Black community would totally isolate him. And then I knew he was going to come to New York, and being a white man who spoke Black English was going to make him completely isolated. And remember, I started as a short story in which he's speaking Black English in the subway station in the 1960s. So it was really something that was going to underscore his isolation. But what ultimately happens is in the first half of the book, he is this white Rebbe in the South who's treated nicely by the blacks around him, but is clearly something other. He's clearly a man by himself. And but for this one woman who falls in love with him and wants to become a Jew, he doesn't have terrible connection there with the people, other than a kind of distant, they try to understand him. He learns their music, he plays with them, and he even preaches, but he is, a Rebbe in rural Mississippi. When they come to New York, there's a crisscross. His wife, who wanted to be Jewish, is very devout, and the Bavaver, tells her she is the Dekrepitzer Rebbitzen, and she is the one who becomes alone in New York because being a Black Jewish woman in 1950s New York was as isolating as being a Rebbe in Mississippi. And there is this crisscrossing in the book where she maintains her very deep faith in Emunah, but their marriage, they finally conclude they just can't live there, and eventually they end up in this farm in South Jersey by themselves. So that is really what my book is about and what I was attempting to do when I wrote it. And I'm happy to entertain any questions people have.
Okay, wonderful. If you don't mind, let's begin. I would like to ask you a few questions first, and then we'll open it up to the floor, if that's okay. So, first of all, I don't think we had this part of the conversation. As I read the book, I was struck by similarities between the two characters you mentioned, both the Dekrepitzer and Hirsch, with Weiss Halivni. Halivni was my dissertation advisor,
Mhm.
actually, and I knew him quite well. And we were close for a long period of time. And that association is quite wonderful because of the complexity of his experience as a survivor, how it affected his theologies and the way he approached tradition and text. I mean, you captured that beautifully. And as you
I,
went through what you were just describing, the many, many details. I said at the beginning, I used the term erudite, but I was reminded even more about how much is here. I mean, any good writing needs to reflect a true capture, a true understanding of what it's representing. And the Hasidic community, the Rebbe, the various other Jewish communities and orientations, the language, what the yeshiva means, what it means to be, use the term Eloi. I don't know if everybody knows that term who's on, but to be this kind of genius at Talmud and its related texts and so forth. How did you yourself master all of this information? Is it from your background, from just something you grew with? Did you have to do research on this? And I would actually ask the same question about the Southern Black community, because I suspect that's not a natural association for you.
I tell people that, I never was to Mississippi and Bizet was never to Spain. So,
Uh-huh.
but, there's a certain advantage when you begin writing when you're 70 because you've got the life experience. Okay. I did go through high school to Yeshiva, I
Hmm.
went to Yeshiva University High School.
Hmm.
But uh, when it came to the Hasidus, I had notions of what Dveikut was, this cleaving and so on, but I had written a lot. And at a certain point, I said, Howie, you come from a totally mitnaged background. I had no Hasidim except for I study with a Hasid, but I had no real background in Hasidism, but I inherited the library of one of the illustrious graduates of JTS. My uncle was Seymour Cohn, and he had a lot of books by Louis Jacobs, including a Hasidic anthology.
Hmm.
And I read this book, the Hasidic Anthology, and found to my astonishment that many of the themes that I had already written about had a vocabulary that existed in Hasidut. So, at least for Hasidus, that's where a lot of it came from, just reading this short anthology by Louis Jacobs. I knew a lot about Hasidus in general, but I didn't know these specific different things, particularly this concept of Bitul Hayesh, annihilation of the self. Um, was kind of funny because I was once on an airplane that was long delayed on the ground, and the guy next to me was a Karliner Chassid, a young guy, and we were talking in Hebrew. He was an Israeli,
Hmm.
and I'm sitting there, I'm not wearing a kippah or anything, and I asked him, to tell me about Bitul Hayesh, and he almost fell out of his chair. So anyway, so that's where I got that. And I didn't do a large amount of research about the South and so on. The war experiences I borrowed from my father's tales. My father was in the Navy during the war. Um, Much of it was really made up. And particularly what went on in the South, I had to find a hospital that they go to. In that reading there, they go to Mount Bayou. So I did the research to find out where the nearest hospital would be to where they were and so on. But not a whole lot of research there. But one of the funny things is I gave a presentation to combined shuls in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and some lady came over to me with a book all about the hospital in Mount Bayou. So anyway, many of the things in the book are things that I struggled with myself and found expression in these characters.
Hmm.
I think maybe I would have wanted in another life to be a black Hasidic Rebbe.
Oh, sounds like a wonderful position to assume. What about, I mean, one very quirky detail that comes up again and again is the Dekrepitzers playing the fiddle in a way that fiddlers consider to be incorrect.
Yeah,
And so was that, what was that about?
it really wasn't, it was a device. You see, when I first wrote the book, when I first started writing, this whole concept of Dekrepitzers was something of a joke, right? The
Uh-huh.
name Dekrepitzer
Yeah,
sounds
sure.
sounds like the name of a Hasidic or thing, but it has the word decrepit, embedded in it. So originally, Dekrepitzers were known because they had one straight paya and one curled paya.
Hmm.
And originally, when he moves his hat, that's how this person he's talking to in the subway station realizes that he's Dekrepitzer because he knew about this.
Hmm.
But my wife said to me that that was too ridiculous and it was too patronizing, and my book was a serious book. So I had to substitute something else that made the Dekrepitzers unique, and that's why they fiddle the way they do. I subsequently learned that there are plenty of Southern American fiddlers who do that. And if you go on YouTube, and you put in left-handed fiddlers, there's actually a Hasidic guy. He's not a Hasidic fiddler, but he's a Chassid who fiddles classically, and he fiddles that way.
Okay, wow. So we've got a question on the chat. I'll share it in a moment. I just want everybody else, while you're listening and thinking, please feel free to write a question or comment in the chat, and I'll share it with the author. Linda Gelman wants to know about Reverend Gary Davis's role in the story.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't mention Gary Davis. There I did do a great deal of research. Okay. One of the motifs in the book are all of these musics. Okay. The Dekrepitzer has his nigunim, and he early on in the book meets Jerry Lee Lewis, who was a teenager who had just been thrown out of a seminary for playing "My God Is Real" boogie woogie style, which is true, actually, that
Yeah.
happened. And the Rebbe ends up on the streets of New York playing with the Reverend Gary Davis, who for some 25 years was said to have only played gospel music on the streets. And
Mhm.
that's where he played, on the streets. He was blind, he was a reverend, and he preached every night at these street corner, these storefront churches. And in the book, there's a speech by him. That is his speech. I found a recording and I transcribed it and
Mm.
made almost no changes to it. And he has his music. And a lot of the book were experiments. And I thought to myself, what would it be like for a Hasidic Rebbe and his music to be playing on the streets with Gary Davis?
Mhm.
And I read up a great deal about Davis. I actually uh, tracked down two of his former students, both of whom were Jewish. One of whom, Andy Cohen, if you go to his website, which I think is andycohen.com, you'll think you're looking at the Dekrepitzer Rebbe. There's a guy with a long white beard, a big yarmulke with menorahs on it, playing Gary Davis on his guitar. Um, but Davis was was going to present a certain music. In other words, there's this exploration of all these different musics in the book, all these different types of musics and their religious significance to their characters. And he also serves an important role in showing the tzidkut, the righteousness of the Babaver, because at one point when I was writing, I said to myself, what would happen if the Babaver Rebbe and the Reverend Gary Davis were in the backseat of a car together? And so by that point in time, I had a pretty good idea of both characters. So I put them in the backseat of a car together. And the Babaver almost immediately realizes the righteousness of this man who, plays on the streets to bring people to Jesus. And the Babaver is very taken by Davis and his music. So Davis plays a rather important role in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. One of our listeners, are you yourself a musician? Did you bring that to your writing of this?
Well, let me put it this way. I could take one of my banjos here and play it, and you can decide whether I'm a musician or not. But I have almost no talent musically, but I was in a very bad accident about 12 years ago, and I was home from work for a year. So I took up the banjo,
Hmm.
and except for the writing, it's become my primary diversion.
Oh, lovely. It's a wonderful way to spend time. You began by speaking about the inspiration and direction you got indirectly from George Saunders.
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with his book. I just lost about writing, about the five Russian short stories.
Well, that was it. He gave a workshop during COVID. My
Right.
son urged me to watch it. It was sponsored by the Free Library of Philadelphia on that book.
Hmm.
And that was what launched me. And
Okay.
I actually met him last week. I was
Oh.
in Philadelphia for a books event for his new book.
Hmm.
And I had told him, when I won the award, I told him, I said, look, you have to understand, you gave this talk, and the next day I started writing for the first time in 40 years. And I ended up winning this award, and he was very generous in writing back to me.
Hmm.
And when I saw he was going to be in Philadelphia, he insisted that we say hello.
Wow. Well, he's
So
such a wonderful writing teacher. It's evident from the book.
yeah.
And you said also interesting. You said the book wrote itself. You described coming down. What's the Dekrepitzer doing today? All of that. I mean, it sounded like it consumed you in many respects during the course of its writing.
Well, I once heard after she died, they played a lot of the interviews with Joan Didion. And she said that when she was writing a book of fiction, she didn't like to go out and see people or anything because she was so involved with her characters, whom she preferred to her friends. Um, I don't, people keep asking me, how did this book come to be written?
Hmm.
Every time, every event, because it's so improbable, the mixture of of motifs and characters. And I can't answer. I keep nudging my wife and saying, well, how did I write this? When did I do this? When did I do that? And so on. But it was, as I say, it wasn't written chronologically. I had different ideas at different points and wrote them and then stitched them together.
Hmm.
But it did kind of, the characters kind of took over.
Hmm.
I will say this, I thought I was finished at a certain point. Like you'll see there on the book, there's a very nice blurb by Barry Holtz.
Yes.
But he read it before it was finished. He read it in manuscript. And after he read it, I got an editor, and she really resulted in my changing several things in the book and expanding the book.
Hmm.
So at that point, she gave me a little direction that
Hmm.
I think led to the book being as good
Yeah.
as it is.
Yeah. A good editor is essential. This is your first book. Is it also your last book, or are there others on the way?
Um, it's like God knows. I'm trying to write something now. I'm well into writing something now, but I don't know whether it'll work out in the end or not. I have to say that it's the things that people have written on like Amazon and Goodreads about the book that drive me to try and write another book.
Hmm.
Like I just can't believe that something I wrote inspired people this way to say these things.
Hmm. Yeah, we've got another question here. Um, One of our listeners wants to know whether, well, first of all, actually, what field of law you practice and whether your lawyerly experience influenced your or influences your writing.
Um, well, I taught antitrust law at Penn for many years. Okay, at the law school at Penn. And that was my specialty. The last 10 years or so, it kind of morphed more into what we call consumer law, class actions against banks that abetted different fraudulent entities and things of that kind. So that's what I did in law. Class action law was also my specialty. I always represented plaintiffs. I almost never represented defendants. Um, I think law very much affected the way I write. If you notice, the book has these very simple short sentences, for example, very, very tight writing style, very few adjectives. That's very typical of legal writing.
Hmm.
It eschews adjectives.
Hmm.
So I never developed much of a vocabulary of adjectives. Second, everything had to logically fit together. I think that's the key. You know, people keep saying it's such an implausible story, but it's made so plausible. And it's made plausible because everything has to fit together. I'll just give you an example, okay? There's Dekrepitz, right? And it's at the end of the road. So
Hmm.
how do you have a town at the end of a road? Roads run through towns. Towns aren't at the end of the road, right? So I had to figure out, well, Dekrepitz was formerly a plantation. So
Hmm.
the road ended there because that was where it led to. Okay, it's formerly was an estate, not a plantation. Well, then how did the people there sustain themselves, right? So I had to create the chickens and the orchard and all the other things in order to answer that question. And all through the book, I was like a lawyer preparing for a deposition, making sure everything kind of fit together in a certain way.
Um, you mentioned early on that you haven't spoken much to Black audiences, but a little bit, some. How has that experience been? How's the book
Well,
received in that conversation?
it's been very frustrating to me because I really wanted the book to get much more exposure in the Black community, and I really haven't been successful.
Hmm.
The one reasonably large Black group that I spoke to, a seniors group at the center that I actually swim at, um, was highly receptive. I was blown away because I was fearful because a seniors group of blacks now would have been militants 25 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was afraid there would be some hostility. And there was none at all. It was quite the opposite. I went there with 20 copies of the book and I left with none.
Hmm.
And it wasn't that they just snapped them up just because I was there. People lingered to talk to me about it, about what I said, and about particularly with regard to the wife. One woman who began by telling me that she was very taken by the wife's agency in the book.
Mhm.
Later on in the discussion, said to me the one thing that didn't ring true at all in the book was the wife's doubts about Jesus on the cross, that
Hmm.
a black woman from her background would never have
Would
had
not
that.
have had such doubts. Wow. Wow. Okay. But I mean, it's interesting that that was the only critique you got of the details.
Right. I had two events at Jewish organizations where the interviewer was black.
Hmm.
But in one case, I don't know, I didn't see much difference between her and anyone else who had interviewed me. In the other place, the person interviewing me was a black preacher,
Hmm.
and he said one thing that was very jarring. He thought that Shmuel Meir fiddled joyously, and he clearly read the book
Hmm.
and read it carefully. But I never, for a moment, thought that the fiddling was at all joyous.
Wow. Okay. Any final questions? I mean, says the questions I've been asking, several of them are my own, but several have come from
Mhm.
listeners as well. Anybody else? Okay, so I'm going to remove Spotlight. You are now the only one on Spotlight, but I'm going to try to remove that too if I can, so that everyone can see. Remove Spotlight. There we are. There we are collectively. Howard, thank you so much for speaking about your book, and to those who have read it, enriching their experience. To those who have not yet read it, inspiring them to go out and get it. And it is both delightful and instructive in many, many ways. So I would encourage you, if you have not yet gotten a hold of a copy, to do that. Um, Thank you for the generosity of your time, Howard. Anything you want to say about where people should buy the book if they haven't bought it yet?
Well, you can get it obviously on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, but if you have an antipathy to buying books that way, any bookstore can order it. They usually don't stock it, but they can order it.
They can certainly do that. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. And everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. Look for announcements of other book talks sponsored by the JTS Library over the course of this semester and to the end of the academic year. And I wish you all a good evening and a warmer, or maybe I should say, a less frigid winter if you happen to live in the parts of the country that have been affected by that. So bye bye. Good night, Howard.
Bye-bye.